Time and Place by GingerBaggins, Chapter 6, Eggshells Stepping On. As it turns out, trying to break into a time turner without actually breaking the thing was a lot harder than Hermione had initially expected. It needed to be functional enough to use, seeing as it was the only surviving turner from the war and their 5th-year excursion to the DOM, so she had to be exceedingly cautious. It still had to work, but for her to continue her other projects, she had to know exactly how it worked. Malfoy had become a welcome presence in the office over the last few weeks. He was still deep in his research and would routinely join her to discuss his plans and gather her thoughts. She perhaps ought to have been frustrated with having to divide her attention between his work and her own, and yet she found herself feeling somewhat flattered by his desire for her input. It was more than signing approval forms. He wanted her opinions. Every day he would come in early and accept a cup of coffee from the pot she kept brewing. He'd then spend the next few hours surrounded by books in his office while Hermione worked on the turner or tried to make sense of her notes. After so many years down here on her own, she'd forgotten the comfort that the sound of a nearby body could bring. Just listening to pages turning and wondering what bit of knowledge he'd stumbled upon. Sometimes on very stressful mornings, she'd make some excuse to hop back an hour just to stretch it out. She still went upstairs to join Harry and Ronald for lunch. Malfoy never accepted her offer to join, despite how much she knew he begrudgingly missed poking fun at them. She didn't know what he did for lunch, and it wasn't her business to pry, though she did love to pry. After lunch is when he'd start pacing between the two rooms and airing every thought that popped into his head. He'd mutter about prune juice while scribbling furiously into some parchment, so he'd place a list of ingredients down on her desk and ask her to request them from the Potions Association as though he did not already have the permission he needed to go and get them without her. It was unrelenting and endearing in a way she'd not expected Draco Malfoy to ever be. There were things that should have been a certainty. Malfoy's lip snarls are out of malice, not jest. He was pompous and dismissive. She did not like him. Regardless of whatever personal growth he had experienced, he was put together meticulously and would never be seen with his glasses fogged or his hair curled from standing over a cauldron. He was an exceedingly serious individual who hadn't a funny bone in his body, and yet within mere weeks, these certainties had been balled up like paper and been tossed into Hermione's mental bin. She was puzzled by him, which was a dangerous thing for Hermione to be. She liked puzzles. She liked puzzles so much that she had allowed herself to become momentarily distracted by the one practically living in the office beside her, and let her wand slip while trying to remove the outer casing of the turner. The thing bit back at her instantly, metal splitting and snapping like a knife before it turned itself over to self-repair. Hermione hissed and grasped at her arm, which was now running red with blood. "The damn thing is practically sentient," she hissed. She lifted her wand in her left hand, not her practiced wand hand. But before she could utter a single healing charm, she watched a long set of fingers wrap themselves gently around her wrist. "Let me," Malfoy said, voice low and eyes locked onto her injury. He lifted his wand and muttered a charm she could not quite make out. She watched in silent thanks as the blood receded and the wound stitched, leaving behind only a small white line. "Why is the time turner attacking you?" She sighed, narrowing her eyes at the beastly thing. "It belonged to Voldemort." The way his entire body flinched at the name did not go amiss, but Hermione was long past the fear of its use. It was discovered on a raid a few years ago. The DMLE employees who found it were obliviated, and it was brought down here for inspection, around about the same time I started. We aren't sure what his plans were for it, but it's been weighed down with protective curses. I've gotten so far as to make it safe to use, but I still can't get into the damn thing to see how it operates without, well, you saw. You are trying to pull apart a cursed time turner, an object that we collectively know very little about, just to see how it works? Malfoy spoke slowly, brows pulling together as though she'd just told him a riddle. Yes, she confirmed. It's important that we understand it so that we can harness its full potential. What for? He asked. Well, fuck. Where to begin? Granger? Because it's my job, she snapped, keen to end this conversation. His eye twitched and she braced for a classic Malfoy rebuff, but instead they flickered down to her arm. The only sign of the last few minutes was the small scar left behind, though she didn't mind it, she was used to them by now. I'm sorry for the mark. I'm usually better at... It's this bloody wand. He was flustered. Your wand? She asked, eyeing it curiously. It took a second to click, but when it did, she felt the blood still like ice in her veins. You are still using a ministry-mandated wand? He nodded, looking nothing short of confused by her reaction. She felt sick. Yes. They were supposed to be temporary. He barked out a humorless laugh, much more like the ones she'd been accustomed to in her youth, except this time the sound didn't shoot rage down her spine. It shot a heavy sense of sadness. Apparently, it still is, but we all know what that means. It's fine. It's not like I've got another one to use. My old one is long gone. No, it's not. Harry gave it to Kingsley. He gaped, looking so taken aback by something she had thought to be common knowledge that she wondered for a moment if she should also throw in the fact that he had been, at one point in time, the master of the most powerful wand in history. She thought better of it. What? His voice was at least 4 octaves higher than usual. We found it years ago while clearing out his attic during the trials. The plan for your employment was already in motion, so Kingsley said he'd keep hold of it until you could use it again, she explained, her tone undercut with bubbling level of fury. It should have been returned to him long ago. They should have never sent one of their own out on raids without the use of a compatible wand. I didn't realize you still didn't have it. You are telling me the Potter has had my wand this whole fucking time. He was angry too, but his tone revealed something much more devastating: defeat. She tilted her head and looked at him the same way she would a diagram, or indeed a puzzle. Well, Kingsley's got it now, but Harry had it since that night at the manor. Malfoy's eyes went from pale blue to pale green in the small second before he flicked them back down to the floor. She'd not thought it possible for him to get any whiter than he already was, but he had turned practically porcelain. The moments seemed to stretch in time between them. All the things she knew he wanted to say, all the things he knew she didn't want to hear. She couldn't stand it, so she slipped out of his grip. How had she not done that sooner? And wordlessly headed out to check the clock. As the door closed behind her, she waved her wand and watched as her familiar otter burst from the end in transcendent blue light. She bent towards it, and it looked back at her with intensity, waiting on her word. Find Kingsley Shacklebolt. Tell him I need a meeting this afternoon. When Draco was summoned to the minister's office 2 days later, he was fully expecting to be fired. Granger had taken the past 2 days off, and he'd spent them spinning out over their last interaction. When she'd mentioned the night at the manor, she must have realized then what a mistake she'd made in hiring him. The man who was once a boy who once watched and did nothing, while his aunt had beaten and tortured her. Kingsley had summoned Draco only twice before, once to inform him of his offer, employment at the DMLE, where he would offer information on the Death Eaters in exchange for relative freedom. The other was shortly after he'd taken a curse to the chest for Weasley, to offer him his position at the office permanently. The latter had secured him both respectable employment and the respect of his peers, who stopped looking at him like he was about to tear up his sleeve and summon a murderous wizard, and started looking at him like he belonged. Draco had been standing outside of the door for far too long. A minute more and he'd officially be late for a meeting with the Minister of Bloody Magic. His parents had taught him many things that he'd now spent years unlearning, but punctuality would remain forever. He knocked. "Come in, Mr. Malfoy." The rumbling tones of Kingsley called back. When Draco pushed the door open, he was immediately met with shaking shoulders and thundering chuckle of the man before him. "I hate to embarrass you, but the door is enchanted. I can see straight through it." "Oh, well, this was a swimming start." "Wonderful," he muttered, and took the seat that Kingsley gestured towards. "What can I do for you, Minister?" "How are you finding the work with Miss Granger?" he asked, and Draco's heart sank further. Here we go. "Very enjoyable, sir. I'm still in the research stages, though the theories are proving to be promising. Miss Granger had been very accommodating." "Oh, great. I have no doubt." Draco wasn't sure that he'd ever seen Kingsley Shacklebolt smile, and yet there it was, wide and loud and unavoidable. "May I see your wand?" The question threw Draco back. He wanted to weigh his wand. The Ministry had not weighed his wand in over 2 years. Why now? The hairs on his arms stood to attention. His spine bolted straight as he leaned back in his chair, and his heart crashed against his ribcage. Did they think he was hurting Granger? Was it the healing charm he'd used? Had she reported him for it somehow? It wasn't. "Mr. Malfoy, I can assure you it's not as bad as you think it is," Kingsley said, holding out his hand. Draco held back a grimace and placed his wand into the open palm, waiting for the worst. Kingsley only sighed as he studied it. "An odd feeling, isn't it?" he said, glancing back up to where Draco remained still as a statue. "To hold a wand that is not yours." "I'm grateful to have a wand at all, sir," Draco answered automatically. Another disconcerting smile. "I'm not your parole enforcer, Mr. Malfoy. There's no need to lie to me." Was this a trick? Draco swallowed twice. "It can be rather clunky." "Then I think we can dispose of it, don't you?" They were taking his wand away? No. Draco was on his feet before he even decided to move. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he snatch the wand and run? He wouldn't get very far. Should he beg? Should he try physically fight the Minister of Magic? Should he yell and scream and smash? Kingsley bent below his desk and presented a long rectangular box. With a quick flick of Draco's ministry-appointed tool, he lifted the lid and revealed a sight that Draco had been sure he would never see again. His old wand. It looked just the same, if not better. His knees almost gave out. He found purchase in the chair he'd not long sprung from. "It's been checked already, and you can take it with you when you leave," Kingsley said, offering the box to Draco. "Why now?" Draco asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kingsley hummed. "There are very few people in the world that could ask anything of me. You just so happen to be friends with 3 of them. Take the wand, Mr. Malfoy, and get back to work." Draco didn't need to be told twice. He took hold of the old familiar hawthorn, sleek, secure, and brilliant. His magic rushed to meet it like an old lover. It was such a rush of exuberance that he almost felt nauseous. He didn't need to hold it tightly. He didn't need to adjust his grip. It just fit. He cast a simple unspoken lumos and watched with completely unbridled glee as it responded intuitively. He might have cried, had the ease of doing so not been so thoroughly trained out of him. Another more niggling thought burrowed into the back of his mind. As he made his way back down towards the DOM, Kingsley said 3. It did not take a genius to figure out that Granger had played an integral part in getting his wand back, especially after he'd brought it up during their last conversation. But had she referred to him as a friend? Is that why Kingsley agreed? Was that what they were? Draco couldn't keep the smile from his face for the rest of the afternoon. Not when he was reading the potions book that Granger definitely hadn't brought in for him. Not when he was writing lists of potential mixes. Not as he left to check the clock in the hallway, or when he sent an owl to Ginevra, agreeing to her offer of a night at the pub. By the time his day was over, and he practically skipped to the lift, he decided there were far worse things for Granger to view him as than a friend. He arrived at the Potter's place not long after finishing that evening. He was keen to press them both for information on what exactly Granger had done to get his wand returned to him. Don't have her ferret. Ginevra was absolutely butchering the preparation of his old-fashioned, and he could barely stand to watch it. You have the delicacy of a troll, he whined. The fire in her eyes was almost as bright as her hair. There was very little Draco enjoyed more than winding Ginevra Weasley, now Potter, up. It was just so easy to do. If you just asked for a beer like a normal fucking person, we wouldn't be in this situation, she snapped, peeling an orange with oafish hands. Someone has to make use of your drinks cabinet, he muttered, eyeing the various bottles that had all at some point been brought only by him as gifts. I'm the only one around here who seems to appreciate the finer things in life. Snob. He would have responded with something terribly clever and witty, as he was most adept at pulling that snort laugh out of the youngest Weasley, had the flu not roared to life. Ginevra's demeanor changed in an instant, her amusement falling off her like dead weight, only to be replaced with a tentative sort of worry. Draco turned to see who had arrived, and found an uncharacteristically disheveled Granger stumbling out of the fireplace, eyes puffy and neck blotchy. He fought the immediate and somewhat terrifying instinct to rush towards her. How did it go? Ginevra asked in the tone that one would usually expect to hear beside a sickbed. Granger shook her head, eyes glued to her shoes. Same as usual. His badly mixed old-fashioned was then levitated towards her, and the spoiled child in him cried out in indignation, but it was obvious that Granger needed it far more than he did. She'd clearly been crying, and Draco was curious by nature. Was this why she'd not been at work for the 2 days? Should he ask? Friends asked, right? Granger, are you... Who's coming tonight, Gin? She cut him off, and he choked on his words. Friends did not ask, it would seem. Harry will be back soon with Ron and Lauren, Ginevra responded, and he felt his blood chill. Weasley and his beau, Potter and his Weasley, and Draco and Granger. This would not do. You are dragging us along to date now, Ginevra? He asked, trying and failing to remain jovial. She sighed and began making another drink. He hoped that it was for him. Potter and the others arrived not long after, each of them offering Granger the same careful greeting that Ginevra had. Draco thought he'd have to physically bite down on his tongue to stop himself from asking questions for answers he was not owed. She barely spoke while they all caught up, and he couldn't pull his eyes away from her shrunken form. She was usually the biggest personality in the room, but tonight she was desperately trying to blend into the walls. By the time they set off for the Dragon, he'd watched Granger knock back 2 large glasses of his old-fashioned. They settled into a fee table in the corner of the pub, and Granger had jumped at the chance to get in the first round, despite the many protests from her friends. She took everyone's order while managing not to make eye contact with any of them before stumbling away to the bar. Draco couldn't take it any longer. He turned to the others at the table and cleared his throat. What is wrong with her? Weasley sighed, running a hand through his dreadful hair while Lauren watched him with a warning look in her eye. It's not really for us to say, mate. Right, he agreed, because Weasley was right. It wasn't for them to say, just as it wasn't for him to know. However, that knowledge did nothing at all to quell his rising curiosity. Or was it worry? He turned back to see Granger at the bar. She looked to be in a hushed and somewhat defensive conversation with the man beside her. She shuffled 1 step away from him. He shuffled one step closer. She was barking something at him, her hair looking positively alive with magic, but he was not listening. Draco watched as the man reached out and placed his hand on Granger's waist. Suddenly, he was on his feet and marching towards them. "I think you'd better remove your hand," he spat as he arrived beside her. The man looked up at him with a smirk, which promptly fell into something far more fearful once he recognized exactly who had arrived. Draco may have been famous for all the wrong reasons, but sometimes it came in handy. "Sorry," the man muttered, collecting his beer and scurrying into the crowd. Draco turned towards Granger, expecting to find her relieved that she no longer had to put up with the vile little slug and his exploring hands. But she did not look relieved at all. In fact, she looked completely and utterly incensed. "I didn't ask for your assistance," she hissed. Draco faltered. There was no way she was mad at him for this. She clearly hadn't wanted that slimy fool's advances. He cleared his throat again, shuffling from foot to foot in a valiant attempt to dislodge the awkward tension building between them. "It seemed like he was harassing you. I thought you might what? Need protection?" She laughed. "I don't need anyone to protect me, least of all you." He knew the bubble had to burst at some point, and here it was. "Right, I'm sorry, She groaned and dropped her head into her palms. "Christ, stop apologizing. If you'd let me. It's just words, Malfoy, and I don't want to hear them." He was at a loss. He knew he had no right to be angry with her, nowhere near as much right as he had to be angry with him. And yet, 6 years of trying and he'd found himself back at square one. It was frustrating, infuriating, confusing, maddening. "What is this?" he asked, wounded. "What are we doing?" "I believe we are arguing in a bar," she replied in monotone. "No," he was shaking his head now, near belligerent. "I mean this. 1 minute we're talking about potions, and you're meeting with Kingsley and getting my wand back, and the next you're giving me a verbal dressing down over a very large glass of scotch, and we've taken 10 paces backwards." She shrugged, nonplussed by his teeniest grasp on his control. "We are colleagues. I asked for your wand to be returned to you because our work is important, and I will not have you brewing with an ineffective tool." She could not be serious. Kingsley thought it had a bit more sentiment to it than that, he snapped. He wasn't sure why this stung as much as it did. His illusion of their budding friendship had died in its infancy, and he was now just as sure of her disdain as he had been 3 weeks ago. He'd not gained anything to lose, so why did it feel like he had? "Kingsley's idea have misled people before," she snorted. "Don't put too much stock in them." Well, that was a surprise. He thought the Golden Trio was right as rain with the minister. They had fought for the order after all. They had run and bled and hunted down dark magic and fought alongside him at Hogwarts. And yet, with how she spoke, it seems as though she harbored no love for him. Perhaps Draco would have asked about it. Perhaps he would have laid a palm on her shoulder and offered her comfort. Perhaps he would have shared tales of his own misguidance, had he not been too completely confounded by her anger. "So that's it?" he asked, laughing humorlessly, the way he used to. "I can't apologize, and we can't be friends? So we're doomed to dance around each other forever?" That about sums it up. Seems pretty venomous for a Gryffindor. She reared back, eyes wide and more alert than he had seen them all evening. A small part of him gained some relief at the sight. "Oh, go fuck yourself." "No, go fuck yourself," he echoed, no longer concerned with apology. "You think this is fun for me? Constantly wondering if you're going to hate me or not that day, not knowing where the line is despite years of trying." "Merlin," she laughed, throwing her head back in exasperation. "I am so sorry you aren't having fun. Your enjoyment is usually my primary concern in all matters. See, he hissed as he began bending towards her, though he was stopped by a prickling and bitter thought that flashed across his mind. Have you been off work to avoid me? Because of that other day? I don't even know what I did. My, that ego of yours has a knack for inflation. Yes, Malfoy, I was so shaken by your mighty proximity that I have been hiding from the most important projects of my life to mope. There cannot possibly be any other reason I may have taken some time. You cannot blame me for thinking, oh, I think you'll find I can. That is impossible. Unmanageable. Do you want me to draw from the project? He asked, correcting his posture in a flash. Her face fell instantly, all animosity gone. All that was left was exhaustion. What? He paused before speaking again, ensuring to check his tone. This was hard enough. He didn't need to shout. You may not want to hear it, but my remorse is sincere. I do not wish to cause you further discomfort. I can withdraw in the morning and provide you with a list of recommended replacements. No, she replied quickly, eyes down at the ground. No, of course not. It is clear this cannot work. Stop, please. She sounded so miserable that it made his chest ache. I've had a particularly bad day for reasons I'd rather not discuss. I'm sorry for lashing out at you. You didn't deserve it. I'm going home. I'll see you tomorrow morning in the office. Granger. Her eyes met his then, wide and glassy, and so profoundly warm that he couldn't have looked away even if he wanted to. I asked you to work with me because I reviewed your credentials. You're the right person for the job. Do not let this or me convince you otherwise. And with that, she was gone, disapparated on the spot, leaving him with a twisting sensation in his stomach and the faint scent of jasmine in his nose. He'd survived a ritualistic branding at age 16. He'd housed a genocidal dark wizard for years. He'd endured every curse under the sun and a battle that had taken the lives of half his schoolmates. But that which would surely be the death of him. And that's the end of chapter